The Agronomists is made possible by Pests and Predators Podcast, the Successors, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry, ADAMA is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of The Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith. Welcome here, everyone who's joined us here live for the broadcast. Kevin is back from the western side of the country, of course. And we've got Ray joining us from Calgary, Jason from southern Manitoba, Viren from, I'm going to say southern Ontario, but who really knows? Viren, let us know where you are. And Kyler as well. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see you on here right away. So wonderful. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion, yes, about wheat midge, yes, about cereal leaf beetle, but probably quite a few other insects as well, both pests and predators, beneficials, and whatever else might be hanging out in that field. So before we get to our guests, I do want to remind everyone, if you collect those CU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow. Let us know you watched the program and get those credits. And just a quick note, of course, next Monday is the holiday Monday. There is no show next week. But there will be on August 14th. We'll be back, of course. All right. So to, of course, talk about the creepy crawlies, what is up in those fields, we have with us Dr. James Tansey with Sask Ag and Dr. John Gavloski with Manitoba Ag. Hello, James. Hello, John. Welcome here.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Hello. All right, James. James, I'll start with you. And I'll start with a thank you to both of you. I know right now is peak scouting, sweeping, out there kind of season. So I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us here. James, I'll start with you. What is keeping you busy in the field right now?
The story for this season has been grasshoppers. We've got some pretty significant pressures in a large triangle from Bengoff in the south up to Leader down to Maple Creek and all parts in between. So not to say that it's blanket coverage or uniform coverage of grasshoppers, right. But we do have some pretty significant hot spots coupled with some very dry conditions, meaning that a lot of growers are struggling with grasshoppers. We had really early emergence of two-striped nymphs, almost 2 weeks ahead of schedule with the great heat that we had the early part of the summer, late spring, and we had large numbers of nymphs moving into a variety of different crops, cereal crops, canola, again a wide variety of crops. As many as 5 applications have gone down in some regions for grasshoppers. Which does beg the question, is that economically viable at that point, and still not had proper control of those grasshoppers. So that's been the big story in Saskatchewan. We have had some other pests as well, some hot spots of diamondback moth, although our monitoring indicated relatively low numbers. Of course, with the heat, they can build up once they arrive. We've had some economic populations of diamondback, some true armyworm issues in some cereal crops, and in some cases some very large populations. I think, John, you guys win for the best video of armyworm damage in cereal. I think that was a canola crop, though, wasn't it?
No, I think it was a cereal crop. Yeah.
But yeah, very large numbers in that case. So.
Oh, now what? Okay, I have so many follow-up questions, but my first one will be, before we ask John, why is it called a true armyworm?
Because the rest are just faking it. No, it's a really silly common name.
Right?
No, so some of the armyworm, cutworm common names are teeter on silly and very difficult to remember and distinguish. So yeah, right. Scientific.
So it's best. A true. Yeah, there you go. All right.
We just like to confuse you, so we name things like Bertha armyworm, fall armyworm, true armyworm. So yes,
but Bertha actually has some basis, because as I recall, the original genus it was Baratha or something that sounds like that. So I think Bertha is a mispronunciation of that. So
yes. Right. So there is some, yeah. Viren says true armyworm pays $7 a month for that designation. Something along the lines of
Yeah.
Twitter and the blue check mark, which is now X. But even that we don't know. So there you go. John, you of course were just scouting for Ligas, I think you said. What is keeping you busy in the fields these days?
Well, we had a really interesting July. We had so many things, I guess, come up from the south. So early on, the army worms that Jim mentioned, all of our agricultural regions had issues with army worms, and we were finding them as far north as the Paw in Manitoba. So this is an insect that migrates in. It doesn't just blow in; it migrates purposely, and yeah, it just was in all of our regions. The crops most seriously affected were the fall rye, the winter wheat, and a bit of the spring cereals and forage grasses. But big populations, that is now just wrapping up. We've gone through the first generation. So those larvae are pretty much done. Second generation doesn't do as much. So we're finally coming out of that one. A diamondback moth, another one from the south. This one blows in. It was more eastern Manitoba, eastern and the eastern part of the central region. So it wasn't right across the province like armyworms, but we did have some issues. And once again, they seem to be fizzling out as we're going between generations. So hopefully the next one won't be as bad. And sometimes you do see populations crash between generations. So we'll hope that happens. And then there's the aphids. So we've got them in a few crops. But right now, most of the calls and inquiries I'm getting is regarding aphids and cereals. And it's a really tricky mix because the crops in some cases have reached that soft dough stage where we don't have to worry about them. But some of the later seeded crops are still in the milky stages. And the populations over the last week or two have just exploded in many fields. So do you spray, don't you spray? And the other thing I would encourage people to just look at it while we're talking aphids. While we were doing our Ligas sweeping today, it was incredible the amount of lady beetle larvae we were finding in some fields, the things that look like little black alligators. Yeah, I almost felt bad. You know, we're dumping these things into our bags to go freeze our samples, and there's dozens of lady beetle larvae in some of these, which we're controlling some of the aphids, but grasshoppers as well. We've got pockets where it's mainly two-striped, and then we've got other areas where we've got our grass specialists, the clear-winged, showing up in some bigger numbers. So they've been an issue. I'm not aware of people spraying 4 or 5 times here. I don't think our problems are maybe as bad as what Saskatchewan is experiencing, but we certainly do have at least localized hotspots in populations. Some agronomists tell me they're watching the grasshoppers, but they really haven't had to do anything. Others, they've had to spray either their field edges or full field.
Ray has a great.
I should add too. We've
Sure.
also
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
we're beginning to get reports of cereal aphids as well in Saskatchewan, and pea aphid at threshold and higher in some crops as well. Despite the temperature, those ones don't like hot temperatures. They typically like things between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius, and you start to see some pretty significant juvenile mortality, 25C and up. But yeah, we certainly had warmer than that, but we're still seeing some populations.
So for both of you, as far as aphids go, is this about on schedule, or is this early for aphids? Where are we at with cereal aphids specifically?
I would say, if anything, it might be a little on the late side, which is good. If they become a problem too early, then there's more widespread spraying. This year, what happened when the aphids got to the point where they were actually at economic levels, some of the crops were already starting to get into that soft dough stage, your earlier seeded crops, at least in Manitoba. And so right now, like over the last week or two, things have really taken off, especially over the last week. Populations have really climbed. Early July, we could find them, but you had to look hard to find them. Then mid-July, like they weren't a challenge to find anymore. Now they're some of the fields you shake the heads and a lot come out. But the good side is a lot of fields are in that soft dough stage or beyond.
Okay.
So that's good. As far as pea aphids go, it was the same thing, at least for us in Manitoba. Um, we did have some fields that were sprayed, a handful that I know of. It wasn't an outrageous number. Um, and a lot of people were in that dilemma. Their pods were already, the seeds were already filling in the pods when the levels really took off.
Right.
And with aphids and peas, the vulnerable stage is when the pods are elongating. So that's what you need to protect, is that stage there. Once you've got the peas, the pods are actually getting bumps and seeds are filling, they don't do as much damage. Now, the crop I was in today was faba beans, and a lot of the pods the seeds were pretty much full. So lots of pea aphids, an incredible amount of pea aphids in some of these fields. But they're at a stage now where it's too late to really do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not having an impact on the plants anyway, so
No,
significant impact. So
not at this point. Okay. All right. So a few things to unpack there, but Ray has noticed your shirt, John.
Oh,
I do
yes.
see a midge. Yes. So midge busters. So
Yes.
do tell. I do want to talk about wheat midge tonight, for sure. But there's lots of many other pests we're going to talk about. But tell me about your shirt. It is a fabulous logo. What's it all about?
Okay, so yeah, I pulled this one out of my insect shirt collection just for tonight because we were going to be
Of
talking
course.
about wheat midge.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a program called the Midge Busters, and basically it's run by CCAN and AEFC Saskatchewan. Saskatoon is involved as well. We basically put up pheromone baited traps to look for wheat midge and see when they're emerging. And so we're the midge busters. We put up traps and catch midge, and um, then we can report on them and tell people when they should be out there at night scouting.
That's right. Okay. So with that, and Jim, this will be, of course, we'll be leaning on you a lot on whenever I think wheat midge, I think Saskatchewan, but that isn't entirely fair. But Jay, if you could, I know it's a little early, but I think it's important because that's a great segue to a clip here with Tyler Wist talking about when to scout for wheat midge and what we're looking for. So we'll take a look at this clip and hear from our sponsors here.
So what you're looking for is you want to be at the lake on the long weekend in July, and you don't want to be in your field scouting for wheat midge, but that's typically when they start to come out. So you get your boat in the background, you want to be looking for your wheat midge at dawn or at dusk because that's when they like to fly. So they, during the daytime, sit down in the canopy. You won't see them until things get calm, sun goes down, and hopefully there's enough light for you to see them. What you're looking for is you are looking for these little delicate orange flies flying around the top of your canopy right around that first week in July. So they're really well timed to the spring rains. So they need 25 millimeters of rain to kickstart their development in the ground. And what else does your wheat crop need? About the same amount. So they're really well timed with the emergence of spring wheat.
They know their stuff.
That's why there's such a big pest here on the prairies.
No kidding. What is yield loss like?
So yield loss, if you've got at our economic threshold, which is 1 on 10 heads, that's where you start to lose yield. If you've got 1 on 10 heads, we're looking at about a 15% yield loss. Now, 1 on 10 heads is not a lot. So you're looking in the canopy and you're watching 10 heads. Now, another problem that wheat midge can cause is grade loss. So when those wheat midge larvae tap into the kernel, those kernels shrivel up. And if they shrivel up enough, they'll just blow out the back of the combine. They won't go into your wheat sample. But if your seeds are only slightly damaged, that'll go in your sample and you can get grade loss. So the economic threshold for protecting your grade is more like 1 on 5 heads.
Oh.
So that's what we're looking at, 1 on 5 or 1 on 10.
Mm-hmm. Anything to really combat it now?
So at that point in time, if you decide that you have a problem in your field and you haven't planted a midge tolerant variety, you're probably going to want to get on your sprayer. So I was showing a picture earlier today of a crop where we had 10 heads and there were 7 wheat midge on those 10 heads. And so each of those wheat midge will lay about 3 to 4 eggs on each kernel, and that will wipe out the kernel. So that kind of pest pressure, which can happen if conditions are right, we can get up to a 90% yield loss in a field.
Oh my gosh.
So back in the 1990s, we had that. We had hectares after hectares being sprayed, and still $130 million in yield loss right here in Saskatchewan.
Our sponsors tonight are ADAMA Canada, the Successors, and the Pest and Predators podcast. The Pest and Predators podcast series is where top entomologists highlight the insect field heroes hard at work for Canadian farmers. Hosted by Real Agriculture Sean Haney and brought to you by Field Heroes, the Pest and Predators podcast is powered by the Western Grain Research Foundation. Find out more at Real Agriculture, download the podcast, or visit fieldheroes.ca. Just got to get down to the music. All right. So wheat midge, little, orange, and Ray brings up a great point. Jim, I'll go to you. How do I know it's a wheat midge? What else looks like wheat midge? Because we've got, I think it's loxanid that can be
That's
similar. How do we know the difference?
Yeah, no, that's a common question that we get, because the occurrence of a small orange fly does not always mean that you're dealing with wheat midge. So we got what are called higher flies and lower flies. So the higher flies, that's animals that look like house flies. So that the general body plan of a house fly versus lower flies, general body plan of a mosquito or a midge. So long antennae, long legs versus the higher fly, short antennae, and your more compact body size. So if you're dealing with a loxanid, it's orange, it's still a small fly, but you're going to have that compact body, short antennae. Their role in a crop is not really well understood. It's thought the larvae are detritus feeders, that is, they're feeding on garbage in the soil. But the adults, probably just seeking pollen and nectar meals and contributing to the next generation as adults do.
Okay, so very important to tell the difference. Now, yes, very important. So thank you, Ray. And this is what I always find fascinating about insects, and we've hit on a few of the things already that we'll dig into a little bit. And if anyone has questions, I open it up. But it's proper identification. But as both of you have outlined, is the crop at the susceptible stage? Because really, if the crop has grown past or moved past that susceptible stage, or if the insect isn't in the damaging stage, that is a completely different story than the opposite. So we really do have to know our friends and our foes in the field. So very, very important there. John, Ray also mentioned, of course, it's not fair that I do think wheat midge, I think Saskatchewan, because it isn't just a Saskatchewan problem, and certainly found across the prairies. What this year, at least, John, has the experience been in Manitoba?
Well, it's been, I'll say, fairly low key, which is a good thing. I haven't had any reports of big wheat midge populations or problems. We did have some of our pheromone beta traps up. Now, we can certainly detect them in our traps, but the numbers didn't seem outrageous in any way. So they're there, they're around. But again, I'm not getting the reports of huge levels, and I'm not aware of anybody having sprayed for wheat midge, which is good because there's 2 active ingredients registered. One is in its last year of use and is not being sold anymore. That's chlorpyrifos, which is your Lorsban, Pyronex, etc. The other one, dimethoate, you can use it. It's got a very long pre-harvest for wheat midge, and it doesn't kill the eggs like the chlorpyrifos. You're targeting adults, so you have to be very timely with it. So on the positive side, like I said, not a lot of issues. My feeling is we probably still have a strong enough population of our key parasitoid macrogalenes penetrans. I know in some years when we've had sticky traps up, we get a lot of the little black wasps in our sticky traps. So they're one of about 300 different species of pteromelid wasps in Canada, and they do an awesome job keeping wheat midge in check.
Yep. Yes, they
Yeah,
do.
Jim, similar story in Saskatchewan. Not a huge pressure this year.
Yeah, it's we had timely and sometimes heavy rains before the
Mm-hmm.
end of May. So I mean, we had the rains to contribute to populations, and looking at the forecast, we had in some cases some relatively heavy populations of unparasitized wheat midge larvae. So there were populations to draw from, but very few reports of spraying this year, which
Mm-hmm.
yeah, happily. So yeah,
Yeah,
we'll wait to see what happens with the upcoming survey,
right.
and we'll look at the levels of parasitization in that. So
Mm-hmm. How has the adoption been with the varietal blends, the VBs? So wheat midge is
very
one of
good.
those interesting ones. Yeah, James, can you maybe just explain that briefly? What we have for midge tolerance and how that's sort of handled in the genetics.
Yeah, you bet. So it's the gene is called SM1, and it's a gene that confers antibiosis resistance, or it's a killing effect on the developing wheat midge larva. So wheat that expresses this antibiosis effect on the developing wheat midge. So this is sold in what's called a varietal blend of SM1 wheat mixed with 10% refuge. So it's a refuge in a bag approach, and reason being is that you want susceptible members of the wheat midge population to continue to be present, so that they can overcome the expression of resistance in populations that have been exposed to the toxin in the plant. So it's a gene for gene reaction interaction. Pardon me. So the possibility of the midge rapidly overcoming that resistance exists without the presence of refuges. And the refuge in a bag is just a very simple solution. It's set it and forget it and go to the lake on Canada Day.
That's right. I really like that. That works out well. It is, at least for wheat, I think a pretty uh, rare occurrence to have something like a refuge in a bag. We see that a lot in corn. We see that, that's something we see in other crop types, but not so much. So it's really interesting to see it in wheat for wheat midge. Still an important one. But as you mentioned, we did talk about some of the mapping, some of the surveys. I do want to get to grasshoppers if we can, because both of you have provided some great maps that we have for grasshoppers. I always ask the question, so let's look at some of these maps, and then did they tell us where to look? So maybe which one, Jay, are we going to start with here? Let's take a look. If we're going to start in Saskatchewan, we're going to start in Manitoba. That's fine too. Okay, so this is August of 2022. John, how we doing? Does it correlate at all?
Well, it does correlate somewhat, but I caution people that this is just a tool, and this basically what the map is showing you is what we found in our surveys last August, which was your egg laying
Right.
population. But there's a lot of other things you need to factor in, such as what were the weather conditions like in August when the egg laying was occurring, overwintering, spring survival, etc., etc. Um, like I said, it's probably not too far off. I know the eastern region, some of the areas that show up as green on the map, there have been some high enough levels that people have been spraying, and there's been some concern. So, say the Beausejour area, which would be in the light green, um, I wouldn't say it's very light this year. There's areas, again, it's localized, but there are some heavier populations there. So this map is really just a tool. And if you're in the green parts of the map, don't be letting your guard down. Still be looking, checking, and especially early in the season. When we put these maps out over the winter, I still encourage people, regardless of what the map is saying, get out there and scout your field edges, the areas where we know we usually get those heavier early season populations. And most farmers and agronomists have an idea where those early populations are often starting out heavy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, scout those areas regardless.
Now, Jay, if we can go to the Saskatchewan map, I think we've got the Saskatchewan map as well. There we go. Yeesh. So, Jim, this is a very different map to the Manitoba one. How are we looking as far as correlating to this year? Because you've mentioned that it's been perhaps much more widespread.
Yeah, it's been. I mean, this is a reasonably accurate representation of what we've seen for pressures. I would argue in the southwest and south, even the far southeast, we've seen some very heavy pressures with grasshoppers. So, um, yeah, we'll say it's a reasonable representation
Okay.
of what's happening. But again, as John mentioned, this is representation of what happened last year. So this is,
Right.
boy meets
Yep.
girl, boy and girl fall in love, beautiful music plays, and they contribute to the next generation. So this is not necessary. A lot of bad things can happen to little
Right.
grasshoppers, right? So
That's right.
so this
So,
isn't necessarily a representation of what we're seeing this year, but it's pretty close.
right. Right. So and to both your points, exactly that. It gives us an indication as to where conditions were favorable to more grasshoppers potentially being made or coming from, but doesn't indicate where we will see them in the spring
Yeah, I think
necessarily.
that should be that should come with an asterisk as well, because
Oh, okay. Do tell.
this is an indication of last year's populations. So I mean,
Ah,
this the
okay.
fundamental building block of this year's populations, of course, is going to be last year's populations, but there's a lot that can happen weather-wise. That can really
Mm-hmm.
negatively or positively impact. What we had was a moderate drought condition overlapped almost perfectly with these grasshopper hotspots. So these
Mm-hmm.
dry conditions, particularly in July and August, meant that oviposition could really proceed at full speed in that case,
Yeah.
and the embryos in those eggs were really developing well with all the heat, so they could make it to the point where they're going to overwinter well.
Mm-hmm. So, Jim, do like other ones, and Ray's asked a question about wheat midge, and I'll get back to that one in a moment. But many insects move in cycles, and sometimes it's a cycle that's, you know, followed by because of parasitoids or pests that sort of keep them in check. Grasshoppers, at least in my mind, seem to be quite driven by conditions. Um, but I think we probably depend on the weather a little too much on taking care of grasshoppers, right? We always think, oh, it's a wet year, we won't have grasshopper problems. So how much can we sort of look at with grasshoppers as far as can we depend on there being a cycle, or is it so dependent on all the sort of pieces in between of making more grasshoppers the next year?
Yeah, I guess I'll maybe flavor this discussion a bit with a discussion of some of the pests that we have that are cyclical. So if we look at animals like Bertha armyworm, that is kind of a classical cyclical pest. Every 6 to 8 years that's going to ramp up. Its populations are regulated in large part by natural enemies. So things like baculoviruses, pathogens have a really profound effect on these animals. And so you'll see cycling in that, and that'll have an effect on these populations. Not to say that they're not influenced by the weather, but I mean,
Mm-hmm.
everything that I've seen and read has indicated that grasshoppers are influenced very strongly by the weather. And
Mm-hmm.
although that feeds back on some of their natural enemies, I mean, when we've had major outbreaks over the decades in Saskatchewan, collapses in populations are associated with cool, wet summers and outbreaks of a pathogen called entomophthora. So John made mention of that one earlier. They tend to climb to the top of plants, grab on for dear life, and then rain fungal spores down on all of their piles.
John, what did
It,
you call it? The
Well,
something.
entomophora. The proper name, Entomophaga grilli, is the genus and species name of it. Grilli refers to the group of grasshoppers. There's actually another species of it, Entomophaga muscae, which affects flies. You'll often see them dead at the top of plants. And one of Jason's students sent me a really cool picture of a whole bunch of dead flies at the top of a barley plant, which would have
Nice.
been the muscae species. But this one's grilli. And it affects grasshoppers. Entomo means insect. Phaga means eating. So this is a grasshopper eating fungus. And what it does is it messes up their mind. Okay, so there's a bit of mind control going on here. When the grasshopper is good and sick, so later, like they get infected earlier on in the season, but then it's living within them, building up in their body. They're getting to the point where they're ready to die. They will do something they don't normally do. They will climb to the top of the plant and they will wrap all their legs around it very tightly. And my student and I were out in a field today. We saw some of this along the ditch on the edge. Some of the grasshoppers were just clinging on. They're already dead, but
Mhm.
you can barely pull them off. Their legs are wrapped around the stems, so they're dying at the top of the plants. Now, eventually, their body's going to start disintegrating, and being at the top of the plant, the spores can then spread over a wider area than they normally would. Um, those spores will overwinter and infect more grasshoppers, and the cycle goes on. So we are starting to see that in Manitoba. It's certainly a natural enemy that helps. There's other natural enemies that we're seeing as well. We saw a lot of both black and ash gray blister beetles this year. And they belong to a group of blister beetles called Epicata. It's a genus. And that genus, the larval stages are grasshopper egg specialists, meaning that's all they eat. And so, yeah, we were seeing a lot of the black and gray blister beetles to the point where I had people calling me saying, should I be worried about these in my crop? Because
Right.
there's a lot of them. They're very patchy. You walk in, if you happen to see one, you're probably going to see a lot. And because they're patchy, they're in big patches. The patches aren't huge, so I usually tell people just keep moving when you see those patches, and appreciate that each of their young ate quite a few grasshopper eggs. So
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Fascinating stuff. I have seen the grasshopper on the top, sort of dead on the top of the plant there, and always wondered what that was about. So very cool. Now, Jim, to your point though about the weather cycles, yeah, go ahead.
Mm. Oh,
Because
sorry.
there's
If
certainly a
I could
question
just
here about, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so if I could just add too about Entomoptera grillii, there are different isolates of this fungus. So each of these can be specific to a specific species of grasshopper. So I've seen fields where all of the clearwing are sick and dying, and they're right next to a bunch of two stripe that are perfectly happy and healthy, and vice versa. There's also something that grasshoppers can do to reduce what the effects of some fungal infections, and it's called behavioral fever. So they will climb up onto a plant. So we can regulate our temperatures, or our physiology
Right.
does it to combat infection. They have to do it behaviorally. So they're climbing up onto structures to get their internal temperature into the high 30s, low 40s, and that's going to diminish the impact of those fungal infections. So they can do that behaviorally, and they get sick, but they don't necessarily die with some infections. But I mean, in the case of Entomoptera, we had not so far this year, but we had some accounts last year of entire fields being covered in, or being occupied by dead grasshoppers. To the point where they could be smelled for miles. I mean, they're big meaty
Ew.
animals. So, yeah,
Big meaty animals.
yeah.
Gross.
If
But yes, it's
I could
true.
add too that there's another natural enemy of grasshoppers that you'll see it pretty commonly with pathogens and parasites, is that they do tend to mess with their host's behavior. And there's another one it's a bit of an interesting variation on the Alien movie. We talk about parasitoids a lot, and the chest burster and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the variation on that are nematomorphs, and so the eggs will be picked up by large insects like grasshoppers or crickets or large beetles when they consume water that happens to have the nematomorph eggs. Now the nematomorph hatches up, and the worm finds its way into what's called the hemocoel of the grasshopper. So if you think of things in terms of a tube within a tube, that's your basic insect design. So you got the mouth and the anus, that's one tube, the gut, and then outside is the cuticle, and all the musculature and organs are hanging from that exoskeleton. All that empty space in there is occupied by the blood cavity or the hemocoel. So that's where this worm is growing up. So when that worm becomes sexually mature, it gets to be really large. I mean, it's longer than its host, and it'll oblige that grasshopper to seek water. And the second that grasshopper imbibes water, then kabam, that worm explodes out the easiest path, which is not the easiest path for the grasshopper.
Yeah, of least resistance.
The path of least resistance. Yes.
There you go.
So Alien would have been a very different movie.
Quite would have been. Oh my gosh, like I don't know how everybody else out there is like, you know what? I'm going to study plants. Why? When you can study insects, they're so much cooler. All right, Kyler has a great question. So in talking about some of these things, so that's an egg that they ingest. When we're talking about a fungal pathogen, how far are we from being able to potentially, and Jim, as you said, some of them are very species specific. Can we buy fungal pathogens and apply them as like a biological insecticide? John, I'll start with you. Or how far away are we from that?
You've opened up a really interesting question here, because in the case of the one that we're talking about, the summit disease or the entomophora,
right.
they've tried. That's not going to happen. It's species specific for one. And it doesn't have a great shelf life. So it's been studied, not practical, so not going to happen. Now, there's there's many different types of these fungal pathogens. There's another one called Metarhizium that there's local strains in our soils. They affect grasshoppers. Research was done with this Metarhizium and showing that it can work very well, that it can have a shelf life where potentially you could have a product out of this. And in fact, in some countries, they are using their own strains of Metarhizium as biological insecticides. There's a lot of politics sometimes behind insecticides and getting them registered. And unfortunately, there's been hiccups here. And even though we have data showing that there are local strains that can be effective, we don't have a product, and we probably won't in any short period of time.
Yeah, I'd be reluctant to indicate it as any sort of political issue. I mean, in the case of that Metarhizium, it is certainly more complicated than going from discovery to registration. But there were certainly some complicating factors in that particular case. There are other Metarhizium that have been investigated for other insects with the intention of commercialization, and some have been commercialized in the United States for agents such as psyllid, for example. I've done some field trials with that to great effect. It looked really promising. And Bovaria bassiana that I mentioned earlier has been investigated for grasshopper control, for lygus control, and seems to be pretty good specificity of some isolates. No registered products currently in Canada of those ones. The ones we do have are BT, of course, for some lepidopteran pests, and for grasshoppers, Nosema locuste, actually now Paranosema. Now lives in a different genus the product. Nolobate, unfortunately, there were some problems with production in 2018, and we were anticipating supplies in June of this year, but that didn't seem to come true.
So this is, I guess this is the other thing to think about. If we're truly talking about biological products, exactly the point you've hit on, they are also prone to supply chain issues, including they are also biological things that we'd have to potentially multiply and then keep alive and all of those things.
Yeah, I think in the case of Nolobate, I think their issue was actually a production facility fire.
Yeah. So which we had for some or not. Yeah, we had that with herbicides too. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what Jim did. There was actually a fire at the plant that made the Nolobate, which is why it wasn't available. Now with the Nolobate, it works very differently though, as it does make the grasshoppers sick eventually. but they will feed. If you want quick kill, you're not going to get it with the Nolo bait. The Metarhizium was a quicker kill. And what was also nice with Metarhizium, targeted to grasshoppers and just grasshoppers. So very selective and a quick kill. Where the Nolo bait, it can be an option, especially for people, say, who are organic. It was an organic product, but you won't get that quick. They're dead in a couple of days. You're building up an infection in the population. It takes a bit of time. So you're thinking long term using a product such as the Nolo bait.
So that does bring up a few more questions that I have, but I wanted just quickly, Producer Jay, if we could go to our last read for the evening. I've got a few questions again about some of these cycles for some of these pests, but let's hear from our sponsors first. Our sponsors tonight are ADAMA Canada, the Pest and Predators podcast, and the Successors. Join host Kara Oosterhuis for the Successors, where she highlights the next generation of agriculture. Featuring interviews with the young crowd, the Successors dives into mentorship, marketing, implementing new ideas, careers outside the farm, and so much more. Download the Successors wherever you get your podcasts or visit realagriculture.com/successors. So along these lines, there was a clip I had pulled, John, that you and I filmed in, I want to check the year, I think it was 2014. It's quite some time ago, with cereal leaf beetle. And that was one that then, and I wanted to check in now, that seemed to have a pretty good cycle as far as sort of pest and predator and working its way through. We're several years out from then. Where are we at with cereal leaf beetle in Manitoba right now?
Cereal leaf beetle has been a good news story for us because when we first found it in 2009, we sent a sample away to Lloyd Dosdell at the time at University of Alberta. He dissected the larva, told us there was 0% parasitism, very promptly sent us a bunch of parasitoids that we released and in the area that we were finding them. And so when you interviewed me in 2014, we were 5 years in. We had been tracking the population. It had spread into the southwest and the central region by then. And we were doing annually releases of this parasitoid. I'm really not aware of any spraying for cereal leaf beetle, Lindsay. We can see the feeding and we can find the larvae. The larvae are easy enough. They look like little drops of oil, and if you kind of rub them, there's a little yellow larva underneath its fecal shield. So we can get into that. Yeah, yes. But anyway, we can find them. I've had a couple of people send me photos this year of some of the white streaks that the larvae leave on the leaves, but more of a curiosity thing. When you ask them how economical it is, well, it's not every plant. It's here and there, which is good. All indications are that the parasitoid that was released is called Tetrastachys julis, belongs to another cool group of parasitoids called the eulophids, which there's almost 400 species in Canada of eulophids. But this one's very targeted. This one really good at finding cereal leaf beetle. One of the surveys we did a few years ago, we were collecting cereal leaf beetle larvae from a part of Manitoba where we never did a release. It was at least well over 100K from any of our release sites. And we were finding 40% parasitism. So somehow the parasitoid was moving with the cereal leaf beetle populations. Eventually what happened was the people supplying me with the parasitoids run out of parasitoids. Their populations were crashing in Alberta, and they couldn't rear enough parasitoids to send me. So I stopped doing releases. We kept on finding cereal leaf beetles further east than we had been, but the parasitoids were making their own way there.
We're moving with them.
So,
okay.
Good news story.
Jim, similar story in Saskatchewan, or is it not an issue there?
No, we get occasional reports of cereal leaf beetle, very, very rarely at significant numbers, and the parasitoid is well established here. A kind of a good, quick, and dirty way to tell if a parasitoid is, a cereal leaf beetle larva is parasitized is they seem reluctant to use that fecal shield. when they are parasitized. So I guess the t-shirt level message is a poopy larva is a happy larva, and you
Right.
can actually see the developing wasp larvae inside the if you look through the cuticle of the cereal leaf beetle larva,
Yeah.
once they're quite advanced. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's touching back on the Alien movie theme.
Yeah, they're it's all alien movies. Okay. So, all right, let's bring it back to a few other ones though that perhaps are of significant concern. Um Grasshoppers this year, as you mentioned, Jim, significant issue in huge areas, and I've certainly seen some of the video coming out from some of these crops that are just decimated by grasshopper, or you're walking through it and it's just waves of them. How does that then, so let's, southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, does that set us up for yet another issue next year, or does it really come down to if we get spring moisture or not? How do we know what to expect?
Yeah, I think judging by what we saw last year, and I think we should probably uh, elaborate a little bit on what's happening with the grasshopper populations. Once again, they're not uniform. So I
Right.
mean, we are seeing significant hotspots, absolutely. But this really devastating pest pressure or grasshopper pressure isn't all the way across the south, but where it does occur, it is occurring pretty significantly.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, much like we saw last year, we've got warm, dry conditions in July. We'll see what August brings, but I mean, with El Nino setting in, and the current long term forecast from Environment Canada indicating prolonged warm, dry weather, I think we're looking forward to a lot of eggs going into the ground, and barring an early frost and or a cool wet year next year, I think we're looking forward to continued grasshopper pressure.
Yeesh. Now, so I think most people would agree. Is there, or what is the best thing you could do then as a grower, as an agronomist early in the year? Is it just scout and try and stay ahead of them, or what's the best advice for trying to keep a handle on grasshoppers?
John, do you want to address
So
or?
yeah, so you've really touched on it, Lindsay. Scouting early is key. Now, when we say early, normally very end of May, early June is when most of the hatch of our pest species is starting. So
Mm-hmm.
um, that's a good time to start scouting field edges, really anywhere that had a lot of lush green vegetation late the previous summer, where they would have been attracted to do their egg laying. Those are good areas to start your scouting. Scout early. This year we were ahead of normal in the cycling a little bit. I would say we had an extremely hot June. They went through their cycles really quickly. I've never seen adult two-striped grasshoppers in June before, and this year, June 25th, was the day that I
Wow.
saw my first adult two-striped grasshopper. Yes, so some years, just because of weather, they get a bit of a head start. And just touching
I may
on what
have
Jim was
Sorry, I may have seen the same one.
so, yeah. I mean, that being said, right now there's still some like I mean, the emergence is so spread out that
Mm-hmm.
now most of them are adults. But even a week ago, we were still seeing a lot of juveniles, but we were starting to see some of our adults even in June, which does prolong the egg laying period. So they
Mm.
start laying eggs sooner when they get developed quicker into their adult stage. The other part to it too is if you don't get a good hard frost until nearly October or into October, they've had this really long period of time when they can lay eggs. And one of the things that differentiates our pest grasshoppers from non-pest grasshoppers, which there are a lot of, by the way,
Yes.
our pest species, they have a very high potential for egg laying, and when they get these really long seasons, they can just lay a lot more eggs. So
Okay.
when we get those first frosts is a big thing. How much rain and what the temperatures are like in August is a big contributing factor to how much egg laying actually happens. So this is where our maps. I mean, as much as we try to predict things with them, it's hard to factor all this stuff in. And
Yeah.
actually, one thing I like to do, I probably make my map a bit wordier than it needs to be, but there's a big long write-up where I do try to explain some of this with the map, because the map alone, I mean, it's a map of August counts, but there's a lot that goes into
Right.
what's likely to happen next year. And the other thing I should
Mhm.
point out, just to clarify some myths out there, I had people calling me in May. Every time you get some hard rains in April or early May, people are calling saying, "So that means no grasshoppers, right?" And I always say, yeah, don't count on that.
Right.
Grasshopper eggs have this thing called a corian around them that is almost water permeable. And a colleague of mine told me he dropped a bunch of grasshopper eggs in a glass of water for a week, poured the water out, the eggs hatched. So those rains in April, early May aren't going to do much. Heavy rains in June, when they're hatching out as nymphs, may do something to
Ooh,
the population.
okay.
It's all timely.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
No, and I mean, to that, we in the Lumsden Craven area, we had a big hatch of two-striped
Okay.
grasshoppers, and a major rain event in mid-June, as I recall, just as the bulk of the nymphs were coming up. Um, and this it was a killing event, a large scale killing event of
Interesting.
nymphs. But I mean, 3 inches in less than a week, and
Right.
lots of dead baby grasshoppers. So it's also possible for it to be too dry for grasshoppers. So yeah, under conditions of severe drought, if those eggs lose 30% of their moisture, they're toast. They will not complete
So,
development.
okay, so Jim, I'm glad you mentioned that, because John says, well, where they had, green, lush green grass to lay their
Yeah,
eggs into, if there isn't any lush
they
green
go.
grass,
They starve.
they're not
Yeah,
going to do so well. So
no, they'll
yeah,
starve.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
one of the recommendations for early season control of grasshoppers has been alternating strips of seeding wheat, alternating with cultivation, and so that you can either prevent the grasshoppers from spreading into the field, concentrating them
Right.
like as a trap crop, or
Right.
have
As a trap. Yeah.
have areas of starvation. So some of the previous work that
Interesting.
was done on tillage with grasshopper control didn't actually negatively impact the eggs or the nymphs themselves, but it removed their food supply. So you could starve them out in spring.
Interesting. All right. Fascinating stuff. We have a few minutes left. Jason's got a question. Switching crops a little bit from cereals into canola. What about cabbage seed pod weevil and swede midge? Now, as I understand it, we don't have swede midge, but John, maybe you can correct me on Manitoba. I think in Saskatchewan, we officially are calling it canola
Canola
midge or
flower
something like
midge.
that.
Ooh.
Canola
Oh
flower
no
midge.
no
Oh no, you're not
And
now.
no no
Oh,
no
this is all.
no.
Oh, Jim, bring it on. All
Okay,
right.
canola
Well,
flower
so
midge. Canola flower
yeah,
midge is a
no,
whole another species. So yeah,
really.
it's there's something in
Okay.
that may actually be a native species, and Boyd Morey and Megan Van Koski
Yep.
are working hard on that one. It does
Okay.
cause damage to canola,
Okay.
but we are monitoring for swede midge, which is a whole another species,
Other, yeah, completely different, right?
and yeah, and we monitor those with pheromone
Yep.
traps, and to date 0.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, and
That's
same
okay.
thing
John,
here.
how about a Manitoba? Yep.
We have pheromone traps up for swede midge. What we do have is canola flower midge. So
Okay.
that was the point I was trying to make. Is there are two midges
Yes.
sorry, there's one midge in canola in the prairies. There's two in parts of Ontario,
Right.
the swede midge and canola flower midge. In the prairies so far, it's just been canola flower midge. There is
Okay.
no swede midge. There were some false identifications
Right.
uh, well, quite a while back now.
Yeah.
What
Years ago
happened
now.
before we knew about canola flower midge?
Yep.
There were some false identifications of swede midge. That's been corrected. So what we do have is canola flower midge. We've been putting up pheromone traps annually. We've got some up this year as well. So far, no swede midge. We can find the kind of pop bottle shaped flowers of the canola flower midge in some areas, especially the Northwest. They seem to be more common, but no, it's not an economical thing at this point. Whereas swede midge, because of the way they feed and the deformations to the plant, it can be a more serious problem, but currently not here.
Right, just
If
in Ontario. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
for sweet midge, yeah. If I could add
Yeah.
too, we've had some recent accounts of canola flower midge getting into pods of developing canola, and
Okay.
resulting in some yellowing of those plants and some fragility of those pods. And you break the pods open, you can find multiple larvae of canola flower midge, not sweet midge, but canola flower midge.
Canola flower
And
midge.
they are
Okay.
both sessets, which are gall midges, and
Okay.
so they result in they both cause undifferentiated growth in their host
Hmm.
plant canola. It's just different. I mean, in the case of canola flower midges, those bell-shaped flowers that John alluded to with Swede midge, it almost looks like residual herbicide damage. They cause some real
Really?
serious deformation.
Yeah. What does it look like compared to like Aster yellows?
That's another one that causes undifferentiated growth.
Yeah.
Yeah, the structures are quite different. Where with aster yellows, you're going to see this blunted growing point. The apical
Hmm.
meristem is going to be quite blunted, and no production of flowers in some case.
Right. At all.
Not,
Yeah.
not not the case with sweet midge. You can still get pod formation, but they're quite visibly deformed.
Okay. Then what about, it's the first time someone's mentioned a weevil, which is one of my favorite insects. They're just jerks, but super cute. With their snouts. Cabbage seed pod weevil. I'll give this I know Alberta, it's an issue. John, is it an issue for Manitoba? What do we need to know?
I won't say it's an issue because we've never found it at high populations. Now, we do a survey annually. We've been doing it for a while, and we're still analyzing our data this year. We have found it further east than we've ever found
Okay.
it. As of last year, the furthest east we'd ever found it was the Carmen area where I'm based. This year we
Mm-hmm.
did see it in Roland, which is east of Carmen, so it's been spreading east. But in a sample of 25 sweeps, we will find maybe one, which so we're they're detectable but not economical currently in Manitoba. In our highest counts in our survey have usually been three or four, and these are the ones in the southwest where it's been
Yeah.
established a bit longer. We might get three or four in our 25 sweep sample, which where that's
It's not.
magnitudes below threshold. So
Right.
it's here. You can find it. It's spreading east, but so far it hasn't been found at economic levels. There's another weevil though. Just as a heads up to growers, we were out in some faba bean fields today, tree hern area of Manitoba, and we were sweeping for another insect, lygus bug. But in our 10 sweeps, we were often getting several pea leaf weevils. So that's not the proper way you scout for them, sweep net sampling. But it's of interest for us to note that we are now finding pea leaf weevil in areas where we just weren't finding them at all previously.
Okay.
So
Jim, cabbage seed pod weevil?
yeah, for Saskatchewan, I mean, it's been established in Saskatchewan since 2000, or that's the first report at any rate. From that point, it worked its way, to the Manitoba border, obviously, and north. Last year was a bit of a good news story, though. So we do actually conduct a survey or contribute to Ag Canada's Cabbage Seed Pod Weevil survey, and we found that the population density was greatly reduced relative to previous years, and the geographic extent of the invasion had actually retracted. So in this year's survey, we were in the Southwest. We were seeing some numbers. We're still analyzing that data, looking at the samples, but it seems that those populations remain relatively moderate. We'll say. I'll say just to be cautious until all the data's in. But yeah, to John's point, yeah, pea leaf weevil. That's quite the opposite, where we've seen a real upregulation of the population of that one after several years of near absence, particularly in the Northeast. That one's really rocketed up, and we're finding lots of it throughout the province this year. So
I would agree with Ray. It's fascinating stuff, especially when you start to figure out how different things attack insects It's absolutely fascinating. Jason's got one last question, John, because Jason's based not far from you. What about soybean gall midge? I've never heard of a soybean gall midge.
We do not have that
Any
here. No,
none?
luckily
Okay.
we've never found that in Manitoba. Now, I would caution people if you do see soybean plants with what looks like a little necrotic dead area right above the soil on the stem, please get in touch with me. What people have found previously is little orange midge-like things on the stem, but further up. And these, in all cases so far, they've been stems with sclerotinia or some other disease in them. And you'll see this in canola as well. There's other midge that like to feed on the fungus growing on the plant. These, so
Interesting.
when we use the term midge, it's a big group of insects.
Yeah.
There's
Right.
fungus feeding midge, there's plant feeding midge, there's predaceous midge.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah. So far, what we
Yeah.
have found, I've had a couple people send me photos of midge feeding in sclerotinia damaged soybean stems on the sclerotinia. So that's
Okay.
not soybean gall midge. Soybean gall midge is a
Gallmish.
bit more serious. They will feed right on the plant itself, not on the fungus. It's usually right above the soil line. So if anyone does see that, please get in touch with me. I would want to get a sample so we can try to rear them out and verify what we've got. But so far hasn't been found in Manitoba. It's a little ways away from us yet. So I'm hoping that Mother Nature will help keep it further south.
Yep.
Yeah, no reports in Saskatchewan either, but I'll just echo what John said.
Yeah.
That or any unusual insect related thing, please contact me.
You guys must have the best mail. Just send it over. What is
It's,
it?
it sometimes gets to be a lot, but yeah, it's never
I
boring.
bet it does. All
There's
right.
never a
All
dull
right.
day in the summer.
Yeah, which I love and I appreciate so much. And so we are out of time, but I thank you both so much, and to everyone in the comments tonight for your great questions. Just fantastic discussion. To John and to Jim, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having
Okay,
me.
thanks, Lindsay.
All right, and to our show sponsors, of course, to ADAMA Canada, the Successors, and the Pest and Predators podcast, which brought to you by Field Heroes, a super great podcast. I think both of our guests tonight have been on it as well. All right, again, no show next week, but I'll be back August 14th for another edition of the Agronomists. Cheers, everybody.